Welcome, and thanks everyone for joining us today for what I think will be a really insightful webinar on a very important topic that's absolutely top of mind for employers right now. I'm Catherine Mayer, the Benefits Editor at HR Executive Magazine. I also am the chair of the Health and Benefits Leadership Conference, and I'll be the moderator during today's event. Please keep in mind we will have time for audience questions at the end of the presentation. Our featured speaker is Kevin Robertson, Chief Revenue Officer with HSA Bank. Kevin has nearly 25 years of experience in employee benefits, insurance, and financial services. He has been exclusively focused on the consumer-directed healthcare industry for more than a decade. He serves on the Healthcare Trends Institute's Editorial Advisory Board and is a board member and compliance committee chairman of the American Bankers Association HSA Council. The HSA Council is the largest trade association and lobbying association on behalf of the HSA industry. HSA Bank, a division of Webster Bank NA, member FDIC, empowers consumers to make the most of their healthcare dollars. With over 20 years of experience, they are a trusted leader in the consumer-directed healthcare industry, providing HSAs, flexible spending accounts, health reimbursement arrangements, and commuter benefits to 3 million members in more than 35,000 employer groups. With that being said, I'd now like to pass things over to our presenter for today, Kevin Robertson.
Thank you very much, Catherine. It's always great to be with this audience and really a special opportunity. I don't think I've ever delivered a webinar from my home. So it's a sign of the times with the coronavirus situation. But again, I just wanted to say thank you for the wonderful introduction. I also wanted to just thank the audience for joining today. I hope all of you and your families are staying safe and managing through this coronavirus situation. And I'm looking forward to presenting on today's topics because it's so timely and there's a lot to cover off. So I'm just going to jump right in. And to start with, I want to just lay out the objectives of what we're trying to achieve with today's presentation. Now, first, we're going to jump in and we're going to take a quick assessment of our current situation, kind of reading in the tea leaves and understanding like what is the reality of the 2020 pandemic, and it has been the genesis for much of what we're going to discuss today. So I think it's important to think about that. Next, we'll jump and cover the numerous legislative and regulatory changes that have emerged in trying to simplify, kind of cut through all of the volumes of information and simplify and narrow it to the most impactful impacts on employee benefits and employers. And finally, it wouldn't be much value rather than just giving information unless we also give you recommendations. And these recommendations are things for maybe employers to consider as we emerge from the current crisis and getting back to business, and it's some things that might be helpful. So why don't we actually start off? Again, we wanted to start by taking a baseline on kind of where are we today. You may not remember, depending on how long ago you registered for this event, but when you did register for today's webinar, one of the questions you were asked were, that if there were any changes that you thought that you might implement as an employer in light of the coronavirus crisis. We pulled all of those responses into a word cloud. For those of you that are not maybe familiar with what word clouds are, when responses come in, the more common they are, the larger they will appear on the screen. So if you look at this, for sure there are some themes that are much stronger than others, some that jump right out, obviously around the significant amount of unsurety or maybe some of the really significant changes that might be being anticipated. Bottom line, there are a lot of really impactful or even, quite honestly, scary words here, things from social distancing and safety, but also things like furloughs and even layoffs. When I was preparing for this presentation, I was looking for ways to truly capture and present, how impactful our current situation is. So I pulled together a few visual representations of this, and the first that I thought was something I would share is looking at the impact on people as measured by the weekly initial unemployment claims. So the chart that you're looking, and hopefully this will kind of put the scope and scale into perspective here, the chart that you're looking at shows the last, 60 years or so of weekly initial unemployment claims. And of course, you have ups and downs from week to week. And if you look at over that period of time, we've really never had a period of a week much over about 700,000 claims. Well, this is the week immediately following the declaration of the federal state of emergency in March. It's essentially nearly 10 times larger than we've ever seen in the history of our country. It's kind of hard to see because this is a week-by-week chart going over so many decades. This actually has followed up with several weeks that were not quite as large, but we're hovering in the 3 to 4 million range each week as well, too. It kind of gets chopped off on the right-hand side. But in terms of visually representing, trying to put this into perspective, I thought this is especially telling. If you want to look also not just the scale of this impact was so large, but the speed at which it happened was actually unprecedented. So looking back at the graphs, the gray areas that you see kind of shaded represent significant periods of increased jobless claims. And, many of these periods will coincide with, very important historical events. For instance, the 1970s oil crisis would be in here. The September 11th attacks would be in there. And, of course, the most recent one that we probably, most everyone on this call probably remembers well, is the housing collapse that led to the Great Recession in 2007, 8, and 9. Now, when you're trying to get a better visual. I know it's hard because you have so many weeks of this graph. What I've tried to do and identify that as quickly as this has happened, it's really nothing in terms of the speed of the current crisis that happened in the jobless claims of the last couple weeks. What I've tried to do here for you is just pull out the visual difference. So again, on the right-hand side of that first bubble, you're looking at the kind of the run-up of weekly jobless claims in the Great Recession versus how quickly the spike of unemployment happened with the current pandemic crisis. So again, very, very important to look at how quickly did this occur. A couple other things we'll look at to put this into perspective. Another way of looking at the impact on employees is to look at where we are for the total unemployment rate. Okay, so again, the graph now that you're looking is after World War II, looking at unemployment rate on a national basis over the last 60 or 70 years. And again, if I were to look at where we are today, we've made a dramatic jump. Obviously, it spiked from sub 4% to about 15% in a matter of a few weeks. Completely unprecedented. In fact, not only is this 50% higher than the highest level that we saw during the Great Recession, it's also the highest level we've seen since the Great Depression. So again, it's unprecedented. And you try and provide visual representation in looking at the financial impact on the economy. Probably the best way to look at that is in gross domestic product. So I've posted here a quarterly representation of the increases and decreases over the last 15 years or so of the GDP in the United States. And if you look on the right-hand side of this chart, you're going to see that in the second quarter of this year, we saw about a 5% reduction, and it's almost directly attributed 100% solely to the coronavirus situation. And remember that as large of a negative impact as this is, remember that this really is only a small part of the total quarter. So the question, really becomes, well, okay, what's going to happen in the future? The reality is we don't know, right? But the economists and most expert economists are expecting unprecedented reduction in GDP, possibly 30 to 40% or more for the quarter. So you might actually see a huge drop in the quarter because effectively we've hit the brakes on the economy in the United States. Again, to put this in perspective, most economists think not only are you going to see a significant drop in the second quarter, but that their reading of the tea leaves probably leads us to the conclusion that we'll see a 5 to 10% reduction of GDP for the full calendar year of 2020, and that would be the lowest since the Depression era. And again, just to put this in perspective versus of where we have been in fairly recent history, in 2008 and 2009, in the Great Recession, the drop in GDP on an annual basis was between 2.5% and 3%. So if we end up being truly in that 5 to 10%, it gives you an order of magnitude, at least 2, 3, and possibly even 4 times as big as the Great Recession. If you look at all of these factors together, along with the unique timing, because essentially we went into this crisis without a run-up, right? This was pretty much as close to a light switch as you're probably going to ever have. It's put us in a situation where we say, well, where does this leave us today? Because we have had absolutely unprecedented impact that rivals the Great Depression. The speed at which that this happened is much faster than really any previous downward market before. We still have a massive amount of unknown and don't have really a clear path moving forward. And as a result, I would tell you that what I think, and I don't know if I'm coining a new phrase, maybe I'd have my 10 seconds of fame from this, but if we've gone through and seen the Great Depression, the Great Recession, I think what we're also seeing right now is the Great Pause. Many industries and sectors have been completely shuttered, perhaps permanently. Obviously, restaurants and hospitality and travel and airlines, and the list goes on and on. But I think every single person on this call would agree that most everyone else, regardless of the industry, is at least at minimum kind of playing a waiting game to see where we go from here. In addition to that, when we do return to work, we're going to be facing a new set of norms in the workplace. The first of which, and undoubtedly, fear is going to be ever present. Be it a little, be it a lot. We don't know yet. And the bottom line is that employers are going to have to manage through this and make sure that they're not only providing a safe workspace, but that also their employees feel that they are safe. The second piece of this is the continued economic uncertainty. We really don't have a clear picture yet of where things are going to go. And finally, and we really won't know this probably for perhaps years, but there are probably going to be radically changed norms moving forward. I think personally what I have seen is the start of what will become a fundamental shift in the way that employees and employers approach a lot of components with their business, especially with regard to working remote. For instance, if you look, prior to this, even a few short weeks ago, many businesses would never have thought it possible to shift their entire workforce or a significant portion of their workforce to being remote. We've seen that. We've seen that from areas of things such as call centers and operations, and bottom line is that the workforce and the workplace may have forever been changed. We may not know exactly how yet, but things that were previously inconceivable may become standard practice moving forward. So we've reached the point of our first poll. I'm going to turn the presentation back over to our moderator to take us through the first poll question.
Great. And here's a question that I've certainly been asking a lot of employers recently as I interview them for articles. So the question is, how much impact is the COVID-19 pandemic having on your business, including your employees and your benefits? So the choices are no impact yet, some impact, significant impact, or radically change my business for the foreseeable future. This will be interesting to find out. And I just want to use this second to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. The recorded webinar and a PDF version of the presentation will be available on our website within 48 hours. And I think the results are coming in right now.
Yeah, that's. I can see those, Catherine. That's absolutely. That's actually probably what I would have guessed. I would thematically answer that. The norm is you're going to have impact, and people are anticipating impact. And if you look at those that have had significant impact and those that are radically changed, it's more than half, right? And so the norms are that there's been a very significant impact potentially throughout our entire audience. So really no surprises, kind of validates what we were talking about before, but I really appreciate everybody's insights on that.
Yeah, it looks like the overwhelming percentage say significant impact, and only 4% say no impact yet. So what do you think about that? Do you think that will eventually change?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, I can't imagine that businesses will not be impacted at some level, but reality is how much and when is probably questions unanswered because a lot of businesses haven't returned back to the workplace yet. So very good insight. Why don't I keep going into the next part of the presentation? And by the way, we'll have a couple of polls as we go along. We like to try and read the input from the audience and make sure we're incorporating that into our presentation here. But let's turn our attention to the legislative and regulatory impacts that have been coming up over the last several weeks. We're going to try and navigate the current landscape of all of the most impactful things that have come out of Washington. I will tell you that our primary focus today are around the legislative relief measures that, especially the most significant of which was the CARES Act. The flurry of federal regulatory changes that have come out in the last couple of days and weeks. I will say we're not really going to cover too deeply the state legislative and regulatory impacts only because, we have people from all 50 states in this audience. It would be hard to have commentary about, 50 different states that have 50 different stay-at-home orders or 50 different approaches to reopening of businesses. However, when we get to it, we will provide, again, in our recommendations and considerations for employers to think about some things that will apply to all employers in all 50 states. So by far the largest of the stimulus, the three stimulus packages that have been passed, and I know obviously there's a lot of talk on what the next future stimulus bills are going to be, but for sure the largest and most impactful so far has been the CARES Act. Now, there has been some confusion on the bill because there were previous versions of legislation called the CARES Act that were attempted to go through Congress, and I've had people send me questions on essentially legislation that never passed. So the CARES Act we're talking about, which is known as H.R. 748, this is the economic stimulus package that is the one that passed the House and Senate, signed by the President, that is specifically trying to address the coronavirus situation. It's about 850 pages of legislation. I'm going to really highlight a couple of key components. Again, there were probably 6 or 7 areas that were really focused on everything from stimulus monies to covering debt and retirement fund access. But again, we're for sake of time today, we're only going to focus on the most impactful that we're directly impacting on benefits and employees today. And so why don't we turn our attention to those? One of the most common questions that we've been receiving is around the structure of the stimulus monies. Again, these are the checks, the $1,200 checks, and then if you had children, they had payments for qualified children. These are the economic stimulus checks that were sent out for Americans. A couple of things that you may or may not be aware, but if you get these questions from employees, I think it would be really helpful for you to know is the structure of the actual stimulus dollars is the creation of a new refundable tax credit. And essentially what they're doing is that the $1,200 check, for instance, that went out to those that are qualified from income level, those payments are really an advance payment of that new tax credit. Now, they created the mechanism for this using the initial, for the initial payments was based on whatever your filed income was, either 2018 or 2019 tax return, depending on which tax return the IRS had from the particular person when they actually generated the stimulus dollars. But just as a reminder, that will be reconciled with your 2020 income tax return. This may require some people to make repayments. For instance, if their income went up significantly in 2020 versus if it had previously been based on either 2018 or 2019's tax return. Also, I'll give you an example of one that I have a friend of mine that actually he is divorced with a child, and his ex-spouse alternate taking the tax credits in their divorce decree, where they alternate taking the exemption for the child. Well, they may find themselves in a situation that, for instance, one of them may be having to repay that stimulus dollars that was credited for the payment of the child because, for instance, if it was based on a 2019 tax return on one spouse's tax situation and the check was made out, but then it's based, the reconciliation is based on the next person's, the person's next tax year, and it's a different person, and their circumstances may change, that may require repayment. So I think that was a really important understanding component that was probably missed by a lot of folks. I get a lot of questions around the PPP program, or Payment Protection Program. So for those of you that may not be familiar what this is covered off in Section 1102 of the CARES Act, and it is essentially a loan program administered through SBA. It was originally designed for employers less than 500 employees. There was some, obviously, probably some news stories you may have seen that some larger organizations that didn't have 500 employees per location had taken, a loan, and their initial monies were used up. I don't know if you saw that in the news. That's the program we're talking about. But ultimately, it was a way for getting a very low interest loan to help small businesses keep going as long as they were to keep their employees, essentially on the payroll. It's related to the employee benefits arena. There have been questions that have been arisen around, well, can I use those funds to make a contribution, for instance, HSAs or HRAs? Again, this is covered off in Section 1102. If anybody wants to look, it's actually covered on page 10 of the CARES Act bill language, and it's fairly generically written. It goes through and it says, well, you can actually use this for instance, salary, wage, commission, and similar compensation, payment of cash tip or equivalent, so on and so forth. What's not necessarily in here, because you may be able to use this, for instance, Section EE on page 11, obviously it says that payment for provisions of group health care benefits, including insurance premiums, so on and so forth. What is unclear is whether or not an employer can use an assumption that a health savings account contribution is a contribution to their definition of health care benefits. That is a gray area that is not clear, only because there have been different interpretations up there. I don't know if it's necessary to make a linear connection there. It is different than an HRA. An HRA is being an ERISA structure, an ERISA program. There is more clarity there because an employer's contribution to an HRA would be deemed as part of the health care benefits package under ERISA, but HSAs are not ERISA plans, so there is a little lack of clarity. It is a question that's been asked by the IRS. It has not been answered yet, but I would say if you're looking to use PPP money to make HSA contributions, talk to your tax advisor, because, again, there are some unclear components there, but perhaps you would want to maybe use those funds to make a contribution or increase pay or make a bonus or some other form of utilization of the PPP funds that it gets to the same end result. So just keep that in mind. Another key employer stimulus program that's been asked a lot about is the employee retention credit program. This is a creation of a new tax credit of up to 50% of $10,000 in qualified wages per employee. So in other words, it becomes a tax credit that's refundable up to $5,000 per employee, and it's really this is for employers that have been partially or fully suspended due to government orders, or those that have had a significant decline in gross receipts. I had a lot of questions about this. I probably could talk about this one for an hour, but I just wanted to point out to you that there is a new IRS website. The link is shown here, and we are distributing a copy of this presentation so you can get that link. But ultimately, you'll be able to get a lot of information, and it's a very complete website resource to answer a lot of questions about the Employee Retention Credit Program. As always, though, obviously you'd want to speak to a tax counsel, before using tax credits and applying for different components of the Employee Retention Credit Program. Let's turn our attention to talk about the direct impacts on consumer-directed health care that came out of the CARES Act, one of which this has been on the wish list of a lot of employers and employees for years, allowing for payment of over-the-counter products as eligible qualified medical expenses without prescription. This means that HSAs, FSAs, and HRAs can now pay for those OTC medicines and such without having that prescription. This effectively repeals the Affordable Care Act. Remember, prior to the Affordable Care Act, you could use these products to pay for OTC without prescription. This change effectively repeals that component of the ACA, and it's retroactive back to the beginning of this year. It also, for the first time, adds menstrual care products as a qualified medical expense, which is for sure a welcome expansion of OTC stuff here. Another component, and this is a significant major change, allowing telemedicine on HDHP without jeopardizing HSA eligibility. I'll go into this in just a second of what this is, because you may or may not be familiar with why this was even an issue. But the bottom line is it will now allow HDHPs to cover telemedicine services without impacting their HSA, and also pay for those services out of HSA's qualified medical expenses. However, it's really important to note this exemption is only valid essentially from now until the end of 2021. Now, before I move on to the background here, you got to remember that what is telehealth? Telehealth these are utilization of services where I pay a flat amount and I get essentially unfettered access to employees, or I may have to a physician. I may have a copay. Ultimately, I can get a telephonic diagnosis and prescription of a service. And previously, if that was afforded to me beneath the statutory deductible, it would be disqualifying coverage. In fact, again, looking at the background, so that you're maybe not familiar, there's 4 requirements to be able to make contributions to an HSA. Number 1, you have to be covered by a high-deductible health plan. You cannot have any other non-permissible coverage, and that's actually the one that's going to be an issue here. Not covered by medicine and not claimed as tax dependent on other person's taxes. Prior to this guidance, honestly, this had been a gray area because the IRS had never formally ruled on whether or not telemedicine was disqualifying coverage in their eyes, and if it was afforded to somebody beneath the statutory minimum deductible to make a qualified high-deductible health plan, it could be deemed as disqualifying coverage. This removes that for the next, essentially this year and next year. However, that actually leaves a question as to, well, what happens after December 31st, 2021? Well, we don't know. I can tell you that there are significant legislative and regulatory efforts underway to try and make this a permanent change or get some type of clarity with the coordination. So I would keep this one on your radar if telemedicine is a part of your offering. It may necessitate maybe plan design changes or that, because what was a lack of clarity before on this has ultimately become a clarity, or at least aspects of it are clear, and we will be closely monitoring this one moving forward. We've reached the point in our presentation for the next poll, so I'm going to turn over the presentation back to Catherine to ask our audience the next poll question.
Great, thanks. And we just want to clarify, too, that you can find the poll question on the right-hand side of the screen. So that's where you're going to go answer it, and you must hit submit for your answer to be recorded. So please keep that in mind. So second poll question, are you looking to procure telemedicine either this year or next? So you can answer yes, no, or our company already offers telemedicine. So this is obviously such a hot topic right now, just so important, right, with everyone being remote and not maybe having access to their doctors, right, Kevin? So what do you expect that people might say to this? And
well, and you raise a very important point when we're talking about today, I would say that most primary care physician services, if you're going to have them, are probably going to be done via telephone anyways. And so this, telemedicine services have become very popular over the last several years, and for good reason. It's a good cost-saving move, and quite honestly, we live in a convenience-based society. So I think this becomes, really prevalent moving forward. And this will, again, undoubtedly, I guarantee there's going to be some more clarity on this, and I would think that I would chalk this up to the modernization of medicine delivery and health care services delivery. So I think that there's going to be permanent changes or some type of coordination in the future, but right now, we've got about the next 18, 19 months to work on that as an industry.
Absolutely. The results, I think, are in. So we have, interesting. So actually the vast majority, 79% said that their company does already offer telemedicine, and then, kind of evenly split between yes and no, a little more for no. 10% say they were not going to look into it, and 8% say yes. So what do you make of those findings?
Yeah, I'm surprised by the 79%. It would be a little bit higher than I thought, but and again, this is a generic question. We didn't specify whether or not, for instance, it was offered in conjunction with your HD-HPD and so on and so forth. So, but it's definitely a very prevalent, as we can see, it's a very prevalent issue. And again, we've got some clarity now that we did not have previously, but it also raises a need to get further clarity in the next 18 months or so. Why don't we turn our attention to the flurry of regulatory notices that have come out. Some of these we'll be able to go through pretty quickly, but again, just wanted to put them all in one place so you have them as a resource moving forward. One of the notices that's come out, or things such as 2020-15. This was a notice that explicitly allowing for paying for COVID-19 related testing and treatment prior to the deductible without jeopardizing ability to contribute to an HSA. Again, gets back to that ability to contribute. It is a small but meaningful change and removed obstacle. The last thing that the government would want to do is keep people from access for testing and treatment and that. So this was a pretty quick, easy change. The next change on here is, again, the tax filing extension. One of the big changes, they pushed out the ability to file your taxes until July 15th. There was a flurry of a couple of actually IRS notices on this as well. Just wanted to clarify for everyone's sake that, because that federal tax filing deadline was extended, so was your ability to contribute for the 2019 tax year until July 15th for any HSA contributions and such. However, just remember that there are different state income tax deadlines that may or may not have been extended, so ability to contribute on a federal basis and a state basis may be different. Guidance seems to be springing up daily. In fact, this new guidance has been released in the last 24 hours. They actually, yesterday morning, the IRS had issued notices 2020-29 and 33. I've tried to summarize what the key points are here. There was actually a number of different things, but I would say, first of all, a big change was that mid-year FSA election changes are allowable now for 2020 for both health and dependent care. Prior to this change, healthcare FSA changes would have needed a qualifying event, which I can talk about Again, previous to this, the qualifying events would have been, some of the things that are identified, for instance, change of job, change, marriage, birth of children, so on and so forth. But for this year, those changes can be allowed. The next thing it does is extends the ability to make claims for any FSA plan or grace period that ends in 2020, regardless of when that was, is now it can be extended to the end of the year. It also allows, again, this is the telemedicine changes. It was allowing the telemedicine expenses to be retroactively back to the January 1st. Previously, it said that it was from the day it was passed moving forward. Now it's back to the beginning of the year. And then the most significant impact in 2020-33 was prior to this change, starting in 2013, there was a allowable $500 FSA rollover. That's now going to be increased at an indexing rate, and it's going to be 20% of the preceding annual FSA contribution limit, rounded to the nearest $10. So beginning next year for plans, the contribution limit for rollovers, not the contribution limit, the rollover limit would be $550, not $500. So those are the main points of these guidance. And just to kind of summarize and look a little deeper on some of these other impacts on benefits, again, on healthcare FSAs, the most important of which is again, outside of 2020, remember that there has been no other guidance allowing salary reduction changes for anything else without qualifying event. Now, there was joint DOL and IRS guidance that's been released over the last few weeks looking at, for instance, the extension of claim payments for the balance of the year. It also allows for different current year plan changes for grace period and rollover and run out. Of course, those things are always options. However, if you're going to undertake any of those, you need to make sure, talk to your ERISA attorney, and of course, any changes you want to update your plan document. We'll come back to this one a little bit later. A note for any employers that may have had furloughed employees, just a couple reminders here, that if the furlough did result in reduction of hours that causes that loss of benefits, loss of coverage, that does trigger COBRA. A couple of components that obviously, just as a reminder, if employees do not receive current compensation, then their obviously healthcare FSA contributions will not continue. However, the full amount of the FSA and contributions made to date for the FSA should still be available. So obviously, those are money and funds that are already been contributed and should be available. And then remember, a furloughed employee is generally not incurring eligible dependent care expenses while on furlough. So just a couple of quick questions around furloughs. Speaking of DC-FSA, obviously change in election amount is allowable under current IRS guidelines, and that, if you would want to add a grace period to your plan, obviously it'll allow employees to use already contributed funds, then, you can do that, but obviously there are a couple of things to do, speak to your plan advisor and change your plan documents. Again, I'll come back to that in just a minute. Some other impacts on benefits on the HRA side. Remember that benefits for HRAs are really determined by the employer, so if you wanted to modify that, of course you could. Previous guidance was released allowing that if you wanted to have a COVID-19 expense HRA, so one that carves out specifically for extra help for COVID-19 related expenses. You can do that if you wish to introduce a new HRA for that. I don't think it's going to be widely adopted, but it may in certain parts of the country be more impactful than others. And so you can do this, and we want to make sure to note that, but I don't know how widely it's going to be utilized. A couple of reminders on commuter. So the monthly, this is a monthly benefit. So remember that employees can change their payroll contributions on their accounts monthly, and again, they can take them down to zero for the time being. That if they have any amounts still in their accounts, and they roll over to future months, and so when they resume work, they can do that. And if this is a concern, the employees that may have purchased a transit pass, they can contact their local transit authority about refunds. So the last section of our presentation is really just talking about recommendations. So we just ran through a flurry of regulatory and legislative changes, and it can be kind of overwhelming. But the good news is all of this is in this presentation as well, I'm going to talk about in just a minute or two about additional resources where you can get more information on some of these topics. But let's talk about some things that employers may want to consider. And what I tried to do is think about, well, what are the top recommendations that employers should do as they return to work, start reopening for business? What should they consider? First, and probably the most important, to the extent that you can. I know that we're all going to be faced with strong economic pressures, but if you can leave benefit structures intact for your employees for as long as you possibly can, that is really going to be impactful and helpful to your employees. Because, everyone is feeling stress in the United States. And, when they come back, it's going to be hard enough coming back into that work environment, but also having to worry about the benefit structure changing. That just adds extra stress, not only to the employee, but probably their significant other at home as well, too. So, again, I would touch benefits as a last resort if you can, right? The second thing is that you got to try and understand what your employees are feeling. Remember that fear and apprehension is going to be present, and we have to make sure we understand what's going on with them at a personal level and craft strategies and responses that relate back to that. So put efforts into trying to understand what your employees are going through. And finally, try and seek to help employees where you can. This could be an economic support or coverage support or education and reassurance. And also, how are we going to do some of these things that may need to be done at a distance, whereas maybe before they didn't need to do that? A couple of reminders around some of these themes or where you might be able to help. So if you obviously do, you can always give taxable bonuses. So obviously that's the easiest and most simple way to impact their economic reality. You can, if you wanted to, increase HSA contributions, but whether or not you are going to do this, I would also tell you that you want to be mindful of comparability and non-discrimination. I have a reminder slide on that is coming up, so I'll come back to that. And, of course, if you wanted to, on an HSA program, you could introduce accelerated HSA contributions, essentially accelerating employer or employee payroll contributions to effectively turn it into an immediate economic benefit, even though the contributions might be coming in over time. So that's something that's been in place for a lot of employer programs over a number of years. The reminder I wanted to talk about for comparability and non-discrimination, comparability applies to all employees, the contributions that are made outside of a cafeteria plan. Non-discrimination instead applies to those made inside of a cafeteria plan. I would just, as a word of caution, I would recommend to employers that if you have made any changes to contributions or started and stopped contributions or furloughs or any of those things, that before the end of your year, I would at least look at your comparability or perhaps run a non-discrimination test to just make sure that you haven't accidentally run afoul of that. If you have any other questions on this, we of course reach out and we'll be of assistance to you. You're going to consider making coverage changes. Obviously, adding telemedicine, we talked about that before, might be something very timely in this coronavirus situation. If you're going to, for instance, make a healthcare or dependent care FSA plan change or an HRA plan change, such as adding grace periods or rollovers, so on and so forth, you may want to do that. I'll come back to that in a second. And, of course, one of the things that you could always do is a Section 139 disaster recovery account. Just incidentally on this, got a lot of questions, but not a whole lot of understanding on these before, and I would tell you that the Section 139 accounts, you don't have to make them a quote-unquote account-based structure where you're, for instance, going to administrator and turning those into something like it would be an FSA or an HRA. It could be nothing more than an accounting ledger that you would wish to do unless you're looking to restrict and, for instance, restrict the utilization of those to certain expenditures and are looking to force substantiation on that at that point. So, again, we could probably talk an hour just on those accounts, but they are seeing some interest in the marketplace. Again, on the FSA, considerations to remind your employees how to spend and address any unspent dollars. A lot of people, we're seeing a big delay in spending. We've seen a very significant drop-off in kind of the day-to-day expenditures and spending because, quite honestly, a lot of primary care physicians and dentistry and so on and so forth is not open. So just make sure that you're reminding people to use those dollars. Obviously, we talked about before allowing for changing of elections, or if you go to a plan level change, just remember if you're going to do that, and again, things you may want to do or consider is adding that grace period or rollover, so on and so forth, you want to make sure that you update your plan documents, you need to provide the adequate notification to your plan participants, and then obviously allow an adequate time for enrollment or the change period. So I'm pretty much at the end of my presentation. I'm going to turn it over to our final poll question, and we'll move into the resources and Q&A section. So, Catherine, if you want to introduce our final poll question.
Absolutely. Another one that I have a lot of interest in. It is, are you currently planning on making significant benefit changes as a result of the pandemic? Certainly been hearing a lot about this both ways, really. So obviously you can answer yes, no, or unsure, and please do so to the right of the screen. And just a couple quick reminders before we see the results. You can replay any of our webinars by heading over to hrexecutive.com and clicking on our webinar page, and of course, this also will be included, and there will be an additional resource passed out to all attendees after we wrap up the Q&A that we'll get into very shortly here. So make sure you stay on to receive that resource. I think that will be very helpful. So Kevin, do you have any insights or guesses as to what attendees might choose right now for these questions?
I'm going to guess unsure is going to be the most common, but it would not surprise me if there's a heavy yes here. I would be surprised if there's a heavy no, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you. I think that it's obviously resulting in people. Oh, look at this! We are wrong.
Wow, that is surprising. That really is surprising.
Wow. So overwhelmingly, the majority say that they are not planning to make significant benefits changes as a result of the pandemic. And 28% are unsure and 5% say yes.
Well, I think evaluation, you may be planning on making changes, but I would for sure expect many evaluations of changes to be undertaken. So, well, we're going to turn now into the Q&A section, but just as a reminder, Catherine just mentioned we've included a simple flyer that outlines a couple of the more significant changes, especially around consumer-directed healthcare to you. We've attached that to the email to go out to the audience. As well, too, is I wanted to provide this link. There's links to more information on the pandemic and other regulatory and legislative impacts at hsabank.com/special communications, and there you can download. There's a really helpful, about a 10-page FAQ that answers a lot of questions around benefits there. So encourage you guys to do that as well, too. With that, I will turn it over for Q&A session with Catherine as our moderator.
Excellent. Thanks again, Kevin. All right, so the first question it looks like that we have coming in is about FSAs. And it looks like it's kind of a two-part question. Someone is asking if an employee enrolled in the dependent care FSA for 2020 for summer child care and due to COVID no longer needs it, what option do they have to receive the money already contributed? Kind of interesting. They can stop their contribution, but do they lose the money contributed? And the second part of that question is if you make a mid-year dependent care FSA like a reduction, can you make another change later this year to either totally cancel or go back to your original election?
So again, it's going to largely be dictated by what you, as the employer, will allow. And I'm going to go out on a limb, guessing that most employers are probably going to be as, we'll say, understanding as they possibly can. The bottom line is, yes, you can change your, if you're going to see a significant change in your utilization of dependent care from your plans, you can change those elections, and that was actually true prior to yesterday's change. But now there's even further clarity around that, presuming that the employer would want to allow that to occur. And if contributions have already been made, I mean, ultimately, by what you're doing is you're going back and hitting the reset button on this. And if you wanted to modify, that you'll have to reconcile. There's the piece of this that's a little extra work for the employer is obviously reconciling the economics and going back and fixing payroll and W-2, but ultimately they can hit the reset button if they wish.
Excellent. And then second question for you is, can you review mid-year healthcare FSA changes? Do employees have to have a QLE to make a change?
Yeah, so that's what we were just talking about before. So QLE is Qualified Life Event, so normally in a healthcare FSA, you would have had to and they're very prescriptive, right? Probably the one that would have been most common this year prior to yesterday's guidance probably would have been the one that says if you've had a employee status change. So and it could be you or your spouse. So for instance, if your spouse was furloughed, that would be a qualified life event. You go back and change the healthcare FSA election. However, yesterday's guidance that came out from the IRS largely negates the need for that, right? They've said if the employer wants to allow plan changes in 2020, they can, and without the need for a qualifying life event, because I would say that we're in a qualifying life event. It's the pandemic.
Absolutely. All right, next question. What is HSA Bank seeing relative to interest in adding HSAs? That'll be interesting.
That's actually a really good question. I would tell you that we're still seeing an awful lot of inquiries come in, an awful lot of requests for proposals, and so on and so forth. If you look at the last 15 years or so of HSA growth as an industry, we have definitely seen, we'll call it the more trying economic times, be a surge to interest in qualified high-deductible health plans, and I don't think this is going to be any different. I think you're going to see, again, this is Kevin Robertson speculation, so take it for what that is, but I think you're going to see a very strong, renewed interest in high-deductible health plans and specifically HSAs because the economic reality of what the economy is going to be faced with over the next couple of years. So, with belts tightening and pennies pinching, every penny is probably going to be more important, and I think you're going to see a lot of people gravitate towards qualified high-deductible health plans and using of HSAs. I mean, HSAs are unquestionably the strongest, most powerful tool to use for not only spending for current health care, but also, and more importantly, saving for future health care needs, especially in retirement. And I think you're going to see a lot of renewed sense in exactly that because, while, yes, the pandemic is kind of a current situation, I think this has overall raised the awareness level of the need for preparing for that rainy day and being engaged in health care.
Absolutely. Next question. From the required changes due to the CARES Act, what are the requirements for communication to an eligible employee?
Yeah, so that's kind of a general statement. It depends on what we're talking about. So, for instance, if you're going to make a plan change in your cafeteria plan, and let's say you're going to change your FSA structure, okay, you have to provide notice to your employees as prescribed in your plan document and documentation, right? So you have to provide them adequate notice and time to respond, so on and so forth. So in that respect, there are certain things that are absolutely required. Other things like, for instance, the my point about the stimulus dollars and the structure there, or some of the changes around OTC, you're under no obligation to explain that. Obviously, I would hope you would try to help explain those things to your employees, but you're under no legal obligation to talk about, obviously ability to use your OTC. As an administrator, we've been a lot of our time and resources over the last month or so have been to crafting and deploying communication resources. We have millions of customers. We have tens of thousands of employers, and just getting the word out on some of these things it's a challenge, only because it seems like the Treasury will come out with something, and the next day they'll come out with another thing, and then the DOL will come out with something. So just keeping up with it the last couple of weeks has really been a daunting task. And so a thank you to the wonderful folks in our organization, in our marketing area, because I know they've been working double time on a lot of this stuff.
Absolutely. Communication is always so important, but I'm sure just so much more now so as well. All right, other questions we have, does the qualifying event period of 31 days still apply for loss of coverage?
So there have been a number of changes around COBRA, and just so that I am not going to make the wrong statement of different things, what I would do is in the FAQ guidance that I directed you to before, and if you give me a second, I'll back up the presentation to that slide here. If you go to here, there's actually an entire section in our FAQ to talk about COBRA. And so you may want to review the different COBRA provisions as well, too. I know there's been additional guidance released, and I know the other reason I'm a little hesitant to talk about COBRA is because yesterday the House was discussing the potential as part of the next stimulus package, some pretty significant changes to COBRA. So I would say that for continuation of benefits, you're going to have to pay a little close attention. So not only look at the FAQs here, but also keep your ear to the ground on that, looking forward in the future.
Great. And I think we have time for one question before we wrap things up. And I think, Kevin, you might have, just any final thoughts you might want to say at the end. Please feel free to do so as well. But for the question, someone has asked, can you give us your perspective on other potential legislative or regulatory changes that may be in the works right now?
Sure. Yeah. So definitely, I will have to break out my crystal ball for that one. I spent a lot of time in Washington D.C. and involved in legislative and regulatory affairs, and just because it's so impactful for our business, I would tell you that there are a lot of different proposals out there being debated, and these were proposals that were being debated long before and during and probably long after the coronavirus pandemic. I would tell you some of the most popular ones might be, for instance, looking at how to solve for people in Medicare that would like to have the ability to still contribute to HSAs, for example. That's a big one. You've seen some pretty substantial ones that look at perhaps maybe we want to disconnect or decouple the HSAs from high-deductible health plans and make it for anybody to contribute to an HSA. That would be obviously a very significant change. And then there's other smaller changes, like, for instance, dealing with people that may have Indian Health Services or TRICARE or different other coverage that may disqualify them from making contributions, and making sensible tweaks to help those audiences more utilize HSAs. Another big one on the FSA front is extending or expanding the contribution limit from its current $2,750 to some higher future level as well too. So a lot is being debated, and I think that there might be some things that get done as part of some of the stimulus packages that are being debated. But a wise man once told me that even the word likely in Washington, D.C. means 1 out of 3. So I can never really comment on how likely an outcome of any of these things are. I know we're at time, so I just wanted to, again, say thank you for your time today, and thank you to our moderator, Catherine, our host at HVLC. My contact information is on this slide. If you have any other questions, we'll do our best to try and answer them if there aren't any. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Catherine.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Obviously, I would like to extend a big thanks to Kevin Robertson of HSA Bank for the great presentation, smart insights and tips. I think everyone has walked away with probably numerous ideas for sorting us through, this difficult time. So, and thank you everyone for joining us today as well. And remember that this recorded webinar, as well as a PDF version of the presentation, will be available on our website within 48 hours. Thanks again. Have a great day and stay safe.